A draft of the treaty is out. I know you guys were burning the late night oil trying to figure out what it actually said. Your gut reaction to this draft?
It's got a long way to go before it's something we can live with. I mean, there's some things in there that have to change, in our view, before this can ever be acceptable to anybody in this country.
You represent the industry, and your concerns about some of the items in here specifically.
Well, we represent the military small arms manufacturers, and so we have a somewhat more narrow perspective on this. Our real concern is the lack of definition. The term transfer is used throughout the treaty text, and it's never defined. As long as we're talking about exports, imports, the things that should be in a trade regulation treaty, we think that's a basis to build on. But right now it's not defined. Transfer could easily mean applying to civilian sales, civilian ownership in this country. We know that's never going to fly.
Well, and we've heard time and time again, year after year, this is not about the Second Amendment. This is not about taking away your right to own a firearm. And what you just said is an indication that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, and that's the irony. There are a lot of groups out there, particularly the last 2 weeks, have said, well, there's a lot of crying wolf, a lot of alarmism about what the treaty could do. And the same groups will say it has nothing to do with civilian ownership or restricting, the Second Amendment in this country. But those are the same groups that are inside the UN, when the cameras aren't around, are working as hard as they can to make sure there is no language allowed into the treaty that would clarify that point. In other words, to preserve an interpretation that could very well mean that it applies to civilian ownership. And that's a real concern to us.
And Alan, to pick up on what you were saying, civilian ownership is still included in this treaty draft. When you look at it, they do not at all recognize the right of self-defense.
That's absolutely right, Jenny. It's not that it's specifically included, it's just that there's nothing separating it from everything else in the treaty. I mean, this treaty is supposed to be about tanks and combat aircraft and things like that, but there's been such a major push over the last couple of years to include small arms and light weapons. We think of those in military terms, but for purposes of the treaty, that includes hunting shotguns, home defense handguns, 22 rifles, everything. And what we would like to see is language exempting those, because that's not really the purpose of the treaty. But these same groups who say this is not about civilian gun control are the same groups saying absolutely there will be no exception for civilian firearms, and that's a concern.
And you stood up there just a few weeks ago, along with Wayne LaPierre, making clear what you didn't want, what you would not accept, and you drove home that very point. But it's obvious when you look at this draft, they didn't care at all about what you said.
Well, that's true, and of course, we don't need. Wayne does a great job of standing up for the NRA. Our perspective is a little bit different. We just try to tell them in practical terms, if you don't take that issue off the table, this treaty is never going to go anywhere. And we're here because we think our exports are strictly controlled by the United States government, and we are competing around the world with arms companies whose governments have no export licensing standards. And we think if the treaty was limited to that one subject and really imposed higher standards on some of our foreign competitors, that would cut down on the problems in some parts of the world. Those are not American guns we're talking about. We're talking about ones from the rest of the world that are not regulated. But we told them, and if you can't make the civilian arms issue go away, and if the treaty's not about that, you should have no problem doing it. But that so far hasn't happened.
No, and if the treaty's not about it, put it in writing. Define what you mean by small arms.
Exactly.
I mean, it's the same old laundry list that the UN has always had, including ammunition. But when you look at what's in the treaty on ammunition, it's still a hot button issue. It's still included. But at the same time, they don't really use the word ammunition. They talk about munitions. Very vague. It's like UN speak.
Yeah, and it's clear that includes ammunition. And that's a whole other set of problems. It's not directly in our lane because our companies don't manufacture ammunition, but it's one more thing that just is going to make it very difficult ever to come to consensus on any kind of treaty text. The lack of definition, the lack of an understanding of how enormously complex it would be to regulate ammunition beyond where we already regulate it, and the very limited benefit from doing so. There's just a lot of folks involved in this who don't understand that issue.
Well, and it's just like Wayne LaPierre from the NRA was saying, you've told us for years, trust us, trust us. It's obvious from this treaty we can't trust them, and that it is about eroding our ownership, the ability to sell and to buy firearms in this country.
I think unless the text is substantially modified, and it's looking like they're probably running out of time to resolve some of these issues, it's going to apply in some future context to civilian ownership in this country. So far, the U.S. delegation has worked hard to resolve that, but whether they're ultimately successful or not remains to be seen. And whether, if they're not successful in resolving that, whether the U.S. actually agrees to the treaty on Friday, which is the day that we have to make a decision as a country. Do we support this or not? That remains to be seen.
And that's the big concern. I mean, they're behind closed doors right now trying to hammer out a final document. What are you hearing from the U.S. delegation? Do they think they're going to actually have a final document by Friday?
There are mixed views on that. I mean, first of all, the U.S. delegation is, as far as I can tell, fighting hard on these points that we're concerned about.
Ammunition, self-defense, those issues.
Right. Whether or not there's ultimately an agreement around the world on the U.S. view is something that can't be predicted. Right now, I'd put the odds of having a treaty at all, 193 nations agreeing, at around 50%. This conference turns into a pumpkin at midnight on Friday. They no longer have the authority to meet and negotiate. There are logistics issues. A lot of these countries just don't have a particular position one way or the other, but they have to go back to their capitals around the world and show them this text and say, is this okay? Getting that done in the next day and a half is just, it's really a long shot.
I can't say it's a surprise what we're seeing in that draft, but what's your message as to why Americans, whether you own a gun or not, should be concerned about what this UN wants to do when it comes to our individual rights?
Well, I think what's made America unique is we have a written constitution.
They don't care about it.
A lot of countries around the world just don't understand that concept, and they don't have a constitution of their own, or if they do, it doesn't have a Bill of Rights in it. So they don't necessarily disagree with what we're saying. They just don't understand what we're saying and how important it is to us. But this is not the only issue that will ever come up involving U.S. individual rights. And we need to maintain that as a consistent position, that those things are important. We're sympathetic to problems that folks have around the world, but there's other ways to work them out without invading American basic constitutional rights.
And as I said before I let you go, they're meeting behind closed doors. There are no pro-gun NGOs sitting in there right now. But the fact that your organization is here, that Tom Mason's with the World Forum on the Future of Sports Shooting Activities, that the NRA is here, it is important, isn't it? Crucial.
Absolutely. Without several of our organizations being here, and like I say, we all have slightly different viewpoints about what our priorities are.
But it's all about the Second Amendment and preserving it.
Well, in our case, we think that is something that's closely related to the future of our industry.
Yep.
And we run a legitimate industry. All of our exports are carefully scrutinized. We feel good about them because the government makes it really hard for us to get an export license, and when we get one, we have every confidence that those firearms are going to the right place. The nations that are trying to put this treaty through, for the most part, don't have any regulations like that. And they have been free from the beginning of time, continuing through right now, to adopt them on their own without a treaty telling them they have to. So that's something I think is a concern.
And so why it's so important that you guys are here?
We think we're making a difference. We think that there are a lot of countries out there that are involved in this process that have come to us and say, I don't understand. And we get a chance to sit down and explain to them. And sometimes that addresses their concerns.
Well, we'll see what happens on Friday. Thanks for taking the time.
Enjoyed it. Thank you, Jenny.